The thunder cracked so loud that evening in June of 1879 that Delilah Sinclair dropped every plate she was holding behind the counter of her father's general store in Lusk, Wyoming, and dove beneath the wooden counter like a woman possessed by terror itself. Samuel Sinclair rushed from the back room, his weathered face creased with concern as he found his 21-year-old daughter curled into a trembling ball, her hands pressed firmly over her ears, eyes squeezed shut so tight that tears leaked from the corners. Rain began hammering against the storefront windows with violent intensity, and another boom of thunder rolled across the plains like cannon fire. Delilah whimpered, a sound that broke her father's heart the way it had every time since she was 7 years old, and lightning had struck the barn while she stood inside it, killing her favorite mare and nearly taking her life too. "Come now, Delilah girl," Samuel said softly, kneeling beside her despite his aching joints. "It's just a storm passing through. It cannot hurt you here." But Delilah could not hear reason when thunder roared. Her whole body shook, her breath came in short gasps, and her father knew from long experience that she would remain this way until the storm passed completely, sometimes for hours. He stroked her auburn hair and whispered soothing words that barely penetrated her panic. The bell above the store entrance jangled, and Samuel looked up to see a mountain of a man ducking through the doorway, water streaming from his broad shoulders and the brim of his worn hat. The stranger stood well over 6 feet tall, with muscles that strained against his buckskin shirt even when soaked through. His hair hung past his shoulders in dark waves, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. But his eyes, pale gray like the storm clouds themselves, held an unusual gentleness as they took in the scene before him. "Storm caught me on the trail," the man said, his voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder, though much gentler. "Was hoping to wait it out somewhere dry and maybe buy some supplies." Another crack of thunder shook the building, and Delilah cried out, her body jerking as if struck. The big man's expression shifted immediately, concern replacing the polite neutrality of a stranger in a new place. "She all right?" he asked, moving closer but stopping respectfully when Samuel held up a hand. "My daughter has a powerful fear of storms," Samuel explained, fatigue evident in every word. "Has had it since she was a child. Cannot reason with her when thunder rolls, cannot comfort her no matter what I try." The stranger removed his hat, revealing more of his weathered, handsome face. He looked to be in his late 20s, with the sun-bronzed skin of a man who lived under open sky. "Name's Quincy Worth," he said. "I've spent the better part of 5 years up in the mountains, trapping and hunting. Seen men with battle terrors act much the same way. Sometimes talking doesn't help, but presence does." Samuel looked uncertain, protective instinct warring with exhaustion, and the clear knowledge that his own efforts never truly helped his daughter through these episodes. "I don't know that a stranger would do any good." "No harm in trying if you will permit it," Quincy said, and something in his calm demeanor, the steady way he held himself, made Samuel nod slowly and step back. Quincy Worth lowered himself to the floor near Delilah, though not so close as to crowd her. He sat with his back against the counter, settling in as if he had all the time in the world. When the next rumble of thunder came, Delilah jerked and whimpered again, but Quincy began to speak in that low, steady voice of his. "I remember the first big storm I weathered alone in the mountains," he said conversationally, as if telling a story to an old friend rather than addressing a terrified woman he had never met. "Was 3 years back, up in the Laramie Range. Sky went dark as pitch in the middle of the day, and the thunder started rolling through those peaks like the mountains themselves were splitting apart. Wind near about tore my shelter clean away." He paused, but kept talking through the next crash of thunder. "Now, I won't lie and say I wasn't afraid. Any sensible person feels something when nature shows its power like that. But I learned something up there in those mountains, something the old Shoshone trapper who taught me his craft once said. He told me that thunder is just the sky reminding us it's alive, just like we are. It's got no more intention to harm than a river has when it flows or wind has when it blows." Delilah's breathing had not slowed, but Samuel noticed that she was no longer jerking quite so violently with each thunder crack. Quincy kept talking, his voice never wavering, never rising in pitch or tempo regardless of the storm's fury. "That same storm, once it passed, left the most beautiful sight I've ever seen. The sun came through the clouds in shafts of light that looked like heaven itself was reaching down to touch the earth. Every tree, every rock, every blade of grass sparkled like it was made of diamonds. The air smelled so clean and fresh that breathing felt like drinking pure spring water. And I thought to myself, nothing that ends with such beauty can be evil in its happening." Minutes passed, perhaps a quarter of an hour, with Quincy speaking in that steady, unshakable tone about storms he had weathered, about the way rain fed the earth, about the peace that came after thunder faded. Gradually, so gradually that even Samuel almost missed it, Delilah's hands lowered from her ears. Her eyes remained closed, but her breathing deepened, slowed, found a more natural rhythm. "That's good," Quincy said softly when he noticed. "You're doing real good. Storm's already passing over. Thunder's getting farther apart. Hear that? That last crash was farther away than the one before it." He was right. The storm was moving east, its fury diminishing. Delilah finally opened her eyes, finding herself staring at the wooden floorboards, her cheek pressed against the grain. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her head and saw the large man sitting near her, his gray eyes patient and kind. "There you are," Quincy said with a gentle smile. "Welcome back." Delilah pushed herself up to sitting, embarrassment flooding her cheeks with color as the panic receded and awareness of her behavior crashed over her. "I apologize," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You must think me completely mad." "Not even a little bit," Quincy assured her. "Fear doesn't make a person mad. It just makes them human. Took more courage than you probably realized to come back from where you were just now." Samuel helped his daughter to her feet, relief written plainly across his features. "I don't know what you did, Mr. Worth, but that's the fastest she's ever come out of one of those spells. Usually takes hours after the storm ends." "Didn't do much of anything," Quincy said, rising to his own considerable height. "Just sat with her and talked. Sometimes that's all a person needs." Delilah looked up at the mountain man, really looked at him, and felt something shift in her chest. His presence filled the small store, not with threat or dominance, but with a kind of solid steadiness that she had never encountered before. He looked like he could tear a tree from the ground with his bare hands, with those powerful shoulders and arms that rippled with muscle even in rest. Yet he had sat beside her with the patience of a saint and spoken with the gentleness of a summer breeze. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Truly, thank you, Mr. Worth." "Just Quincy, madam," he said. "Mr. Worth was my father, and he's been gone these 10 years now." "Then I'm just Delilah," she replied, managing a shaky smile. "And this is my father, Samuel Sinclair." The two men shook hands, and Samuel's estimation of the stranger rose considerably when Quincy didn't try to prove anything with his grip, despite clearly having the strength to crush bones if he wished. "You said you needed supplies?" Samuel asked. "After what you just did for my girl, least I can do is see you outfitted properly." "I can pay fair price," Quincy said firmly. Wasn't looking for charity, just a dry place to wait out the weather. Then let's call it a neighbor helping a neighbor, Samuel countered. You new to these parts? Just passing through, or so I thought, Quincy replied, but his eyes drifted back to Delilah as he spoke. Been up in the mountains too long, I suppose. Thought I might see about settling somewhere with actual people again. Maybe find work that doesn't require me being alone for months at a time. Delilah had moved behind the counter and was gathering up the broken pieces of the plates she had dropped. Her hands still trembled slightly, aftershocks of her panic, but her mind was clear enough now to feel thoroughly mortified. She was a grown woman of 21 years, not a child, yet she had just spent the better part of an hour cowering on the floor like an infant. What must this capable, self-sufficient mountain man think of her? But when she glanced up, she found Quincy looking at her with nothing but concern and, unless she was very much mistaken, something that might have been admiration. You run this store with your father? He asked. I help, yes, Delilah said. My mother passed when I was young, so it's been just the two of us managing things for as long as I can remember. Must take considerable strength, Quincy observed. Running a business, managing inventory, dealing with all manner of folks coming through, that's no small thing. Delilah blinked, surprised. Most men who came through town barely acknowledged that she did any real work at all, assuming her father handled all matters of importance while she merely decorated the space. Thank you, she said again, finding herself saying those words to this man more in one evening than she typically did in a week. Samuel pulled together a selection of supplies as Quincy described what he needed. Coffee, flour, salt, some dried beans, jerky, and ammunition for his rifle. As they conducted their business, conversation flowed easily. Quincy explained that he had grown up in Missouri but headed west after both his parents died from fever, seeking something he couldn't quite name. He had spent his first years out west working cattle drives, then mining, then trapping, never quite finding where he belonged. But a man can't live alone forever, Quincy said, accepting the wrapped parcels Samuel had prepared. Gets to thinking too much when the only voice he hears for months is his own. Starts wondering what the point of it all is if there's no one to share it with. Lusk is a good town, Samuel said warmly. Growing steadily since the railroad started surveying through here. Always need skilled workers, and I imagine a man with your obvious capabilities wouldn't have trouble finding employment. What sort of work is available? Quincy asked, and Delilah noticed he had positioned himself so he could see her while he spoke with her father. Something about the attention made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Miller down at the lumber mill is always looking for strong backs, Samuel said. And there's talk of expanding the railway station come fall, which would mean construction work. If you're skilled with horses, the livery stable owner mentioned needing help just last week. Or if you prefer working for yourself, there's plenty of homestead land available for claiming outside town. Quincy nodded thoughtfully, counting out coins to pay for his supplies despite Samuel's protest. I'll look into those options. Much obliged for the information and the supplies. You have a place to stay tonight? Samuel asked. Storm's passed, but it's getting on toward full dark. Was planning to make camp outside town, Quincy said. Nothing I'm not accustomed to. Nonsense, Samuel declared. We've got a room above the store that we use for storage mostly, but there's a cot up there and it's dry. You're welcome to it for the night, especially after what you did for Delilah. Quincy glanced at Delilah, as if seeking her approval for the arrangement. She found herself nodding perhaps more enthusiastically than was proper. Please, she said. It's the least we can offer after your kindness. Then I accept with gratitude, Quincy said. Thank you both. They closed up the store as true night fell, and Samuel showed Quincy up the narrow stairs to the storage room. Delilah lingered below, ostensibly tidying up the last of the mess from her panic, but really trying to process everything that had just happened. A complete stranger had managed to reach her in the depths of her terror, something no one had ever accomplished before. Even her father, whom she loved dearly, could only wait out her episodes, unable to penetrate the wall of panic that thunder erected in her mind. But Quincy Worth had reached her somehow. His voice, steady and unshakable as bedrock, had given her something to anchor to in the chaos of her fear. She pressed her palm flat against her chest, feeling her heart beat strong and steady now, and wondered at the sudden longing she felt for that voice to speak to her again. Samuel came back downstairs, moving slowly, his age showing more than usual after the eventful evening. "Interesting fellow," he remarked. "Good man, I think. You can tell a lot about a person by how they respond to someone else's suffering. He didn't mock you or treat you like you were foolish. That speaks to character." "He was very kind," Delilah agreed quietly. "I've never been able to calm down so quickly before. I still don't quite understand how he managed it." "Maybe you will if he stays around long enough," her father said with a knowing look that made Delilah's cheeks warm. "Now, off to bed with you. It's been an exhausting evening for us both." Delilah bid her father good night and walked the short distance to their small house behind the store. But sleep proved elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Quincy Worth's steady gray gaze, felt the strange safety of his presence, heard his deep voice telling her about storms in the mountains. She touched her own face, surprised to find herself smiling in the darkness of her bedroom. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the world washed clean by the previous night's rain. Delilah rose early as always, dressed in one of her practical calico dresses, and plaited her auburn hair into a neat braid down her back. She told herself she wasn't hurrying because she hoped to see Quincy before he left, but her heart knew she was lying. When she arrived at the store, her father was already opening up, and Quincy was descending the stairs with his gear. He had clearly washed up, his long hair damp and pulled back, his beard neatly combed. In the morning light, Delilah could see details she had missed the night before: the small scar above his left eyebrow, the laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his serious demeanor might indicate, the sheer breadth of his shoulders that seemed built for carrying heavy burdens without complaint. "Morning," Quincy said, his voice still rough with sleep but warm. "Wanted to thank you both again for the hospitality. Slept better under a roof than I have in a good long while." "Coffee's on," Samuel said. "And Delilah makes biscuits that could convince a dying man to live another day just to have one more. You should join us for breakfast before you head out." "I wouldn't want to impose," Quincy began, but Delilah interrupted. "It's not an imposition," she said, more forcefully than she had intended. Then, more softly, she added, "Please. I would like the chance to thank you properly for last night, and breakfast seems a poor offering, but it's what I have." Quincy smiled then, a real smile that transformed his rugged face into something approaching beautiful. "Well, when you put it like that, I'd be a fool to refuse." They ate together at the small table in the back room of the store, and conversation flowed as easily as it had the night before. Quincy asked questions about Lusk, about the people, about what life was like in this corner of Wyoming. Delilah found herself talking more than she usually did, describing the rhythms of the town, the characters who made up its population, the way the seasons changed the landscape. "Winters must be harsh out here," Quincy observed, accepting his third biscuit despite his protests that he was eating them out of house and home. "They can be brutal," Samuel confirmed, "but we manage." Store does good business year-round, and we put by supplies carefully to see us through when the snow gets too deep for travel. You ever get storms in winter? Quincy asked casually, but his eyes flicked to Delilah. Thunder and lightning in the snow. Sometimes, Delilah admitted, her voice dropping. Not as often as in spring and summer, thankfully, but yes, it happens. Must be difficult, Quincy said gently. Being afraid of something you cannot predict or control. Delilah appreciated that he spoke of it directly rather than dancing around the subject the way most people did. It's been the defining limitation of my life, she said honestly. I cannot travel far from home because I might be caught in a storm. I cannot attend evening socials in summer because storms roll in so suddenly on the plains. I feel like I've built my entire existence around avoiding something that cannot be avoided. That's no way to live, Quincy said, and there was no judgment in his tone, only sympathy. Fear should not be a cage. Easy to say, Delilah replied, though without heat. Harder to accomplish. I suppose that's true, Quincy acknowledged, but I've learned that most hard things are worth doing anyway. Samuel watched the exchange with growing interest. He had seen men try to court his daughter before, though not many, given her fear made her isolate herself considerably. But he had never seen her respond to anyone the way she seemed to respond to Quincy Worth. There was an ease between them, an understanding that seemed to transcend their short acquaintance. After breakfast, Quincy gathered his things but hesitated at the door. I'm going to look into those work opportunities you mentioned, he said to Samuel, but his eyes were on Delilah. If I do find employment and decide to stay in Lusk, would it be all right if I called on you both again? You'd be welcome anytime, Samuel said immediately. And if you need any help getting established, you just say the word. I know most of the business owners in town, and my recommendation carries some weight. I appreciate that more than I can say, Quincy said. He turned to Delilah, and for a moment they just looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. I hope to see you again soon, Delilah. I hope so too, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Then he was gone, ducking through the doorway and out into the bright morning. Delilah moved to the window, watching as his tall figure strode down the main street of Lusk with purpose in every step. She pressed her fingertips against the glass, already missing his presence despite having known him less than a day. That's a good man, Samuel said from behind her, and unless I'm very much mistaken, he's quite taken with you. Father, Delilah protested, embarrassment and pleasure warring in her tone. I'm old, not blind, Samuel said with a chuckle, and you're quite taken with him too if I'm reading the signs correctly. Delilah couldn't deny it, so she didn't try. Instead, she turned from the window and threw herself into her work, trying to distract herself from the constant wondering about what Quincy was doing, whether he would find work, whether he would truly stay in Lusk, whether he would come back to see her as he had implied. The day passed slowly, each customer's arrival making her heart leap with hope before disappointment settled in when it proved to be someone else. By closing time, she had convinced herself that Quincy had moved on, that whatever had passed between them had been a product of heightened emotions and a storm, nothing more. But the next morning, shortly after they opened, the bell above the door jangled and Quincy Worth entered the store, dressed in new clothes that looked purchased rather than trail-worn, his hair still damp from what must have been a bath at the town's bathhouse. He held his hat in his hands and looked almost nervous, an expression that seemed odd on a man of his obvious confidence. "Morning," he said. "I came to report that I've found employment if you're interested in hearing about it." "Of course we are," Samuel said heartily. "What did you find?" "The livery stable owner, man named Patterson, hired me on the spot," Quincy explained. Turns out he's been trying to manage the place alone and getting too old for all the heavy work. I'll be handling the horses, doing repairs on the building, general labor. The pay is fair, and he's letting me stay in the room above the stable until I can afford better lodging. That's wonderful news, Delilah said, and meant it so completely that her voice came out almost breathless. I'm so glad you're staying. Are you? Quincy asked, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her skin warm. Because I'll be honest, the work was only part of my decision to stay. The larger part had to do with wanting to see you again. Samuel cleared his throat. I just remembered I need to check on inventory in the back room, he said, making himself scarce with a complete lack of subtlety that would have made Delilah laugh under less nerve-wracking circumstances. Quincy stepped closer to the counter, though he maintained a respectful distance. I know I'm moving fast, he said, and I know we only just met, but I've spent the last 5 years living alone, thinking alone, being alone. And I've learned that when something feels right, when something feels true, a man shouldn't waste time pretending otherwise. What are you saying? Delilah asked, though her heart was already racing because she thought she knew. I'm saying that I would like permission to court you properly, Quincy said plainly. I'd like to call on you, take you walking if you're willing. Let you get to know me as more than just the stranger who helped you through a storm. And I'd like to get to know you, Delilah Sinclair, because in the short time I've spent in your company, I've felt more at home than I have anywhere in this world. Delilah gripped the edge of the counter, needing its solid reality to ground her. I would like that very much, she said, her voice shaking slightly. But you should know that my fear, it isn't something that will just go away. You helped me once, but that doesn't mean I'm cured. The next storm that comes, I'll likely be just as terrified. I know, Quincy said gently. And I'm not looking to fix you, Delilah, because you're not broken. I'm just offering to be there to sit with you through whatever storms come, if you'll let me. Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from being seen and accepted and wanted exactly as she was. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll let you. Quincy's smile was like sunrise, slow and warming and illuminating everything. Then I'll come by tomorrow evening after I finish work, if that suits you. Maybe we could take a walk, let you show me more of the town. I'd like that, Delilah said, already counting the hours until tomorrow evening. True to his word, Quincy appeared the next day just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and pink. He had cleaned up after his day's work, and he offered Delilah his arm with endearing formality. She took it, acutely aware of the solid strength of him, the way his muscles flexed beneath the fabric of his shirt even with such a simple gesture. They walked through Lusk slowly, Delilah pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the town's brief but colorful history. Lusk had been founded only a few years prior, growing up around the cattle industry and the promise of the railroad. It was still rough in many ways, with more saloons than churches and more ambitious plans than actual buildings, but it had a vitality that Delilah had always appreciated. Do you ever want to leave? Quincy asked as they paused at the edge of town, looking out over the rolling plains that stretched endlessly in every direction. Sometimes I dream about seeing other places, Delilah admitted. But then I think about being caught in a storm somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere without my father or my own bed to retreat to, and the fear stops me cold. I've never been further than 50 miles from where I was born. Would you want to travel if the fear wasn't a factor? Quincy pressed gently. I don't know, Delilah said honestly. I've spent so much of my life defining myself by my limitations that I'm not sure who I would be without them. Does that make sense? More than you might think, Quincy replied. I spent years defining myself by how far I could get from other people, how well I could survive alone. Convinced myself it was what I wanted, that solitude was strength. But really, I was just afraid of needing anyone, of being vulnerable to caring about someone who might leave or die or disappoint me. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, and then Quincy said, "Maybe we're both learning that fear doesn't have to be the thing that defines us. Maybe we can define ourselves by what we choose despite our fear." "That's a nice thought," Delilah said softly. "I'm just not sure I'm brave enough to live it." "You're braver than you think," Quincy told her, and the conviction in his voice made her almost believe it. Their courtship progressed through the summer weeks with a sweetness that surprised them both. Quincy proved to be a devoted suitor, appearing at the store every evening after his work at the livery to walk with Delilah, to talk with her, to simply be near her. He never pushed for more than she was comfortable giving, content to let their relationship develop at its own pace. He met more of the town's residents, quickly earning respect through his solid work ethic and quiet competence. Patterson at the livery sang his praises to anyone who would listen, claiming he had never had such reliable help. Quincy also started doing odd jobs around town on his days off, building a reputation as a man who could fix almost anything and who never charged more than was fair. For Delilah, having Quincy in her life was like discovering a color she had never known existed. He made her laugh with his dry observations about town characters. He listened when she talked about her dreams and fears with an attention that made her feel truly heard. And when storms rolled through, as they inevitably did on the Wyoming plains, he was there. The first storm after their courtship happened on a Tuesday evening in late July. Delilah was helping her father close the store when she saw the clouds building in the west, dark and ominous and moving fast. Her breath hitched, panic beginning its familiar climb up her throat. But before it could fully take hold, Quincy appeared in the doorway. "Saw the weather turning," he said simply. "Thought you might want company." He had not asked if she needed him, had not made a fuss or drawn attention to her weakness. He had simply come, as steady and reliable as the earth itself. When the first rumble of thunder sounded, Delilah was standing behind the counter, and Quincy was beside her in an instant. "I'm here," he said quietly. "You're safe. I've got you." And then, as the storm built to its full fury, Quincy began to talk as he had that first night. He told her about his day, about a particularly stubborn horse he had been working with, about a joke another customer had told him. His voice never wavered, never changed in pitch or intensity regardless of how loudly the thunder crashed. He spoke as if they were sitting on a porch on a calm summer evening rather than enduring nature's violence. Delilah found that if she focused on his voice, if she let it anchor her, the fear still came but it did not consume her. She could breathe through it, ride it like a wave rather than drowning in it. When the storm passed, she was tired but functional, aware of her surroundings rather than lost in panic. "You're getting better at this," Quincy observed, and there was pride in his voice. "Only because of you," Delilah said, but Quincy shook his head. "I'm just here," he said. "You're the one doing the hard work of facing your fear. Don't discount your own courage." By late August, it was clear to everyone in Lusk that Quincy Worth and Delilah Sinclair were deeply in love. They made no secret of it, walking through town hand in hand, sitting together at church on Sundays, stealing kisses when they thought no one was watching. Samuel watched his daughter bloom like a flower, finally getting enough sun, and his gratitude to Quincy was immeasurable. One evening, as autumn began to tinge the air with coolness, Quincy asked Samuel for permission to speak with him privately. The two men sat on the bench outside the store, and Quincy turned his hat nervously in his hands, a gesture so unlike his usual steadiness that Samuel had to smile. "I love your daughter, sir," Quincy said without preamble. "I love her more than I thought it was possible to love another person, and I would like your permission to ask for her hand in marriage." Samuel had been expecting this conversation for weeks, but hearing the words still filled him with a bittersweet mixture of joy and loss. Delilah was his only child, the center of his world since his wife had died, and giving her to another man's care was not easy. But if he had to choose anyone, he could not imagine a better man than Quincy Worth. "You have my permission and my blessing," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I have to ask, have you thought about what it means to marry a woman with Delilah's fear? There will be storms, Quincy. Many storms over the years, and each one will require patience and presence." "I know," Quincy said, "and I'm not going into this blind or with any illusions that love conquers all obstacles without effort. But I've thought about it considerably, and here's what I've concluded. Every person comes with something, some fear or pain or struggle that their partner will have to help them bear. Delilah's is more visible than most, but not more or less valid, and the truth is, she helps me too." "How so?" Samuel asked, curious. "She's teaching me that needing someone isn't weakness," Quincy said. "That letting someone in, being vulnerable, caring deeply about another person's well-being, that's actually the bravest thing a man can do. I was so proud of my independence, my ability to survive alone. But surviving isn't living. Living is what I do when I'm with Delilah, when I'm part of something bigger than just my own solitary existence." Samuel clasped Quincy's shoulder, his eyes damp. "Then you have my wholehearted blessing, son. Welcome to the family." Quincy proposed to Delilah the following evening, taking her to the same spot at the edge of town where they had stood on their first walk together. The sky was clear and full of stars, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. He got down on one knee, pulling out a simple gold band that he had bought with his savings, and asked her to be his wife. Delilah said yes before he had even finished asking, tears streaming down her face as she pulled him to his feet and kissed him with all the love that had been building in her heart for months. They held each other under the vast Wyoming sky, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, a refuge from loneliness and fear, a home in human form. They married in October of 1879, in the small church in Lusk with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Delilah wore a dress of cream-colored silk that her father had special ordered from Cheyenne, and Quincy wore a new suit that fit his broad frame imperfectly, but gave him an air of heartbreaking earnestness. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Quincy kissed his bride, there was not a dry eye in the congregation. Samuel had insisted they take the small house behind the store as their home, claiming he would be more comfortable in the storage room above the shop, now that he was getting older, and stairs were harder to manage. It was a kind fiction, everyone knew, but Quincy and Delilah accepted with gratitude, knowing it gave Samuel peace to have them close by. Their first months of marriage were sweet beyond measure. Quincy continued his work at the livery, but came home every evening to his wife, marveling privately that he had ever thought solitude was preferable to this. Delilah bloomed under the steady devotion of married life, growing more confident, more willing to take small risks. Winter came early that year, and with it came snow and wind, but mercifully few thunderstorms. Delilah had always found winter easier to bear, and she and Quincy settled into domestic rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. They cooked together, read together in the evenings by lamplight, talked late into the night about their dreams for the future. "I'd like to have children," Delilah said one night in December as they lay in bed, Quincy's arm around her, her head on his chest. I know that might seem strange, given my fear. What kind of mother can I be when I fall apart at the sound of thunder? You'll be a wonderful mother, Quincy said with absolute certainty. And any child of ours will learn from your example that having fear doesn't make you weak, and that asking for help is a sign of strength. Those are good lessons. Will you help me? Delilah asked quietly. When I'm pregnant, when we have babies, when the storms come and I'm needed but I'm falling apart, always, Quincy promised. Through every storm that ever comes, Delilah, I will always be here to hold you close. Spring arrived with its usual drama, the snow melting rapidly and turning the streets of Lusk into rivers of mud. And with spring came the storms, rolling across the plains with renewed vigor. But this time, Delilah faced them with Quincy at her side, his presence a bulwark against her panic. She discovered that her fear was lessening incrementally, so gradually that she almost didn't notice at first. She could now sometimes remain functional through an entire storm, could help customers, or continue working as long as Quincy was near. It was not a cure. Her body still tensed at thunder and her heart still raced, but it was progress. And progress, she was learning, was enough. By summer, Delilah knew she was pregnant. The realization came with a mixture of joy and terror that left her breathless. She told Quincy one evening as they walked together, the words tumbling out in a rush, and he stopped dead in the middle of the street and picked her up, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Delilah, we're going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happier than I've ever been in my entire life," Quincy said, setting her down gently and cupping her face in his large, calloused hands. "You've given me everything I never knew I needed." Samuel was beside himself with excitement at the prospect of becoming a grandfather. He immediately began planning, insisting on buying a proper cradle, talking about expanding the house to make room for the coming addition to their family. Delilah watched her father's excitement and felt her own fear about motherhood ease slightly. She would not be alone in this. She had Quincy, she had her father, she had an entire community of people in Lusk who had embraced them both. The pregnancy progressed normally through the summer and into the autumn. Delilah experienced the usual discomforts but nothing concerning, and the local doctor pronounced both mother and baby healthy. Quincy was attentive to the point of being almost comically overprotective, barely letting Delilah lift anything heavier than a teacup and fretting every time she seemed the slightest bit tired. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Delilah reminded him regularly, but his concern touched her deeply nonetheless. Winter came again, their second as a married couple, and Delilah's belly grew round and full with their child. She had to stop working in the store for the last months of her pregnancy, the physical demands becoming too much, but she kept their home and prepared for the baby's arrival with the help of the other women in town. In February of 1881, on a bitterly cold night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Delilah went into labor. The doctor was summoned, along with Mrs. Patterson from the livery and several other experienced mothers from town. Quincy stayed at Delilah's side through the entire ordeal, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement as she labored to bring their child into the world. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Quincy felt a terror deeper than any storm could provoke as he watched his wife struggle. But Delilah proved to have reserves of strength that even she had not known existed, and as dawn broke over Lusk, Wyoming, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to the entire household. "A boy," the doctor announced, placing the squalling infant on Delilah's chest. A healthy boy, and his mother is doing fine." Quincy looked down at his wife, exhausted and radiant, and at the tiny person she had brought forth, and felt tears stream down his face without shame. "You did it," he whispered to Delilah. "You were so strong. I'm so proud of you." "We did it," Delilah corrected softly, touching their son's tiny hand with wonder. "I couldn't have done it without you." They named him Thomas Samuel Worth, after Quincy's father and Delilah's, and the baby quickly proved to have inherited his father's lustiness and his mother's auburn hair. Samuel was a devoted grandfather from the first moment, spending hours just staring at his grandson with besotted wonder. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Delilah discovered that motherhood was both harder and more rewarding than she had imagined. The first time a storm rolled through while she was alone with Thomas, who was perhaps 6 months old at the time, she felt the familiar panic begin. But then Thomas started crying, frightened by the thunder, and something shifted in Delilah. Her baby needed her. Her fear was still there, still real, but her need to comfort her child was stronger. She picked Thomas up, held him close, and began singing to him, her voice shaking but steady enough. She found that focusing on soothing him helped soothe herself, that being needed by someone smaller and more vulnerable gave her strength she had not known she possessed. When Quincy came home and found her rocking Thomas through the tail end of the storm, singing softly, he felt his heart might burst with love for his wife. She looked up at him, and her smile was tremulous but real. "I did it," she said. "I got through it. Not perfectly, but I got through." "You're amazing," Quincy said, kneeling beside the rocking chair and putting his arms around both of them. "Absolutely amazing." Life in Lusk continued its rhythms, seasons passing in their ordained fashion. Thomas grew into a sturdy, cheerful child who adored both his parents and his grandfather. Quincy had moved from the livery to working as a general contractor, using his skills and strength to help build the growing town. He had a reputation as the best carpenter and builder in 50 miles, and there was always more work than he could handle. Delilah returned to helping in the store once Thomas was old enough, bringing her son with her and teaching him his letters and numbers between customers. She had grown into a confident woman, still wary of storms but no longer imprisoned by her fear. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. When Thomas was 3 years old, Delilah became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, as if her body remembered what to do. She gave birth in the summer of 1884 to a daughter they named Caroline Grace, a tiny thing with dark hair like her father and a serious expression that made everyone smile. Their family complete, Quincy and Delilah settled into the life they had built together in Lusk. Samuel, now in his 60s, gradually stepped back from running the store, training Thomas even at his young age to someday take over the family business. Quincy built them a larger house on the edge of town, a sturdy structure with a view of the plains and enough room for their growing family. One evening in the spring of 1886, as they sat on the porch of their home watching Thomas and Caroline play in the yard, a storm began building on the horizon. Delilah felt the familiar tension begin in her shoulders, but it was muted now, manageable. She reached for Quincy's hand and he took it, his grip warm and strong. "Here comes weather," Quincy observed mildly. "Yes," Delilah agreed, "but we will weather it together." As the storm rolled closer and the first rumbles of thunder began, Quincy called the children inside. They had learned from their mother's example. Thomas protective of his younger sister when thunder boomed, Caroline brave despite her young age. Quincy settled everyone in the parlor, Thomas and Caroline on the rug with their toys, Delilah in her favorite chair with mending in her lap. When the storm hit in full force, thunder crashing and lightning illuminating the windows in brilliant flashes, Quincy began to tell a story. He spoke of mountains and streams, of animals in the forest, of adventures that captured the children's imagination and pulled them through their fear. Delilah listened too, her hands busy with her mending but her heart full, anchored by the sound of her husband's voice telling tales to their children. She realized with sudden clarity that this was what Quincy had done for her all along. He had given her something to focus on beyond her fear, something to anchor to when panic threatened to sweep her away. And now he was teaching their children the same skill, not by eliminating danger or fear from their lives, but by giving them tools to face it. The storm passed, as storms always did. The children returned to their play and Quincy came to sit beside Delilah, pulling her close against his side. "You did well," he murmured against her hair. "So did you," she replied. "You always do." Years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1889, having lived to see his grandchildren thriving and his daughter happier than he had ever dared hope. His death was mourned deeply, but there was comfort in knowing he had lived a full life and died surrounded by love. Thomas proved to have his grandfather's head for business and took over running the general store when he was barely 18, showing a maturity beyond his years. Caroline, who had inherited her father's quiet strength and her mother's compassionate heart, became a teacher in Lusk's growing school system. Both children married and had families of their own, filling Quincy and Delilah's home with grandchildren who called them Grandpa and Grandma, and brought endless noise and joy. Through all of it, through every change and challenge, every loss and triumph, Quincy and Delilah remained each other's constant. The passion of their early love matured into something deeper and more resilient, a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and devotion. Delilah never fully conquered her fear of storms. Even in her 60s, thunder could still make her tense, could still send her seeking Quincy's presence. But the fear no longer ruled her life. She had traveled with Quincy to Cheyenne several times, had visited Thomas when he opened a second store in a neighboring town, had even gone on a trip to Denver when Caroline graduated from Teachers College. She had learned that fear could coexist with courage, that limitations could expand without disappearing entirely. One summer evening in 1901, when they had been married for more than 20 years, Quincy and Delilah sat on their porch watching yet another storm roll in across the plains. They were older now, silver threading through Quincy's dark hair and Delilah's auburn having faded to a softer shade, but the essential core of who they were remained unchanged. "You remember the first storm?" Delilah asked as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Every detail," Quincy said. "You were curled up under that counter, shaking so hard I thought you might shake apart. And I thought to myself, this is a woman who needs someone, and maybe I'm someone who needs to be needed." "And were you right?" Delilah asked with a smile. "We were both right," Quincy replied, pulling her close against his side, his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "You needed someone to hold you through the storms, and I needed someone to hold, someone to protect, someone to love. We were both right." The storm arrived in full force, wind whipping through the trees they had planted around their home, rain drumming on the roof, thunder shaking the walls. But inside, Quincy and Delilah sat peacefully, his arm around her, her head on his shoulder, riding out the storm together as they had ridden out hundreds before and would ride out hundreds more. "I love you," Delilah said, "not for the first time and certainly not for the last. Thank you for being my shelter through every storm." "And I love you," Quincy replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Thank you for teaching me that love is worth more than solitude ever was. Thank you for letting me be the one to hold you close. The years that followed continued in much the same vein. A comfortable rhythm of seasons and family gatherings, of work and rest, of storms weathered and sunny days enjoyed. Quincy's construction business had long since been passed to a younger man, though Quincy still consulted on major projects when asked. Delilah had fully handed over the store to Thomas, but loved visiting and dispensing advice, whether asked for or not. Their children gave them a dozen grandchildren between them, and those grandchildren began having children of their own, creating a sprawling family tree that had its roots in that first stormy night when a terrified woman and a lonely mountain man found each other. Family gatherings at the Worth house were loud, chaotic affairs with multiple generations talking over each other, children running underfoot, and enough food to feed a small army. Through it all, Quincy and Delilah remained the steady center, the patriarch and matriarch whose love story had become something of a legend in Lusk. Young couples starting out would be told about Quincy Worth and Delilah Sinclair, about how he had helped her face her greatest fear and how she had taught him to embrace connection. It became a touchstone for what love could be when founded on respect, patience, and genuine caring. In the summer of 1910, when Quincy was 58 and Delilah 52, they took a trip to revisit some of the places that had been meaningful in their shared life. They traveled by train now, the railroad having long since come through Lusk as predicted, making travel easier for aging bodies. They went to Cheyenne, where Delilah had bought her wedding dress, and to Laramie, where Quincy had once trapped in the mountains above the city. During their time in Laramie, Quincy arranged for them to hire a guide and horses to ride up into the mountains, to the places where he had spent those solitary years before meeting Delilah. The mountains were as beautiful as he remembered, perhaps more so because he could share them with his wife. They camped for 2 nights under the stars, and on the second night, a summer storm rolled through the peaks. Delilah tensed as the thunder began, but she did not panic. She moved closer to Quincy where they sat by their campfire, and he put his arm around her without comment, just as he had done thousands of times before. The storm was magnificent in the mountains, the thunder echoing between peaks, the lightning illuminating dramatic vistas in brilliant flashes. "It's beautiful," Delilah said, and realized with something like wonder that she meant it. She was still afraid, could still feel her heart racing and her muscles tense, but she could also appreciate the raw power and beauty of the storm in a way she never had before. "You're beautiful," Quincy replied. "Watching you face your fear over and over again all these years, never giving up, never letting it stop you from living, that's been the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed." They made love that night in their tent with the storm raging around them, and it felt like a reclamation of something, a triumph over the fear that had once ruled Delilah so completely. Afterwards, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the thunder fade into the distance, Delilah felt more at peace than she ever had in her life. The trip back to Lusk felt like a victory lap, a celebration of all they had built and overcome together. When they arrived home, their family was there to greet them, Thomas and Caroline and all the grandchildren and great-grandchildren eager to hear about their adventures. Quincy and Delilah shared stories late into the night, and watching her husband with their family, seeing the love and respect everyone had for him, Delilah sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the storm that had brought them together all those years ago. The next decade passed peacefully, with only the usual troubles that came with aging, aches and pains and failing vision, but nothing that prevented them from enjoying their life together. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1919, with a party that seemed to include half the town of Lusk, which had grown considerably from the rough frontier settlement it had been when they first met. During the party, their grandson, Thomas's eldest boy who had been named Quincy after his grandfather, stood to give a toast. Young Quincy was 22 now, home from serving in the Great War, and he looked at his grandparents with open admiration. "To Grandpa Quincy and Grandma Delilah," he said, raising his glass, "who taught all of us that love means showing up day after day through every storm that comes. Thank you for being our example of what marriage should be." There was not a dry eye in the room as glasses clinked and people cheered. Quincy Worth, now 67 years old, his hair more silver than dark, and his body not quite as powerful as it once had been but his eyes still that same steady gray, stood and pulled his wife to her feet. He kissed her in front of everyone, a kiss that spoke of 40 years of devotion and a love that had only deepened with time. In the summer of 1921, as they approached their 42nd anniversary, Delilah fell ill with pneumonia. It came on suddenly, as such things often did, and despite the doctor's best efforts and Quincy's constant nursing, she grew steadily weaker. The entire family gathered, knowing the end was near, offering what comfort they could. Quincy barely left her side, holding her hand, talking to her even when she was too weak to respond. He told her stories of their life together, reminded her of moments they had shared, assured her that she had been the greatest blessing of his life. On her last evening, as a summer storm rolled across the Wyoming plains, Delilah's eyes opened and focused on her husband's face. "The storm," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I know, my love," Quincy said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "But I'm here. I'm holding you close through this storm, too. You're not alone. You'll never be alone." Delilah smiled, a peaceful expression settling over her features. "Not afraid," she whispered. "Not afraid anymore. You taught me that." With her family surrounding her and her beloved husband holding her close, Delilah Sinclair Worth passed peacefully from this world, riding out her final storm wrapped in the love that had sustained her for more than 4 decades. Quincy's grief was profound but not destructive. He had loved deeply and been loved in return, had built a life and family with a woman who had been his perfect match in every way. He mourned, as anyone would mourn such a loss, but he did not fall apart. The strength she had given him over their years together sustained him through his sorrow. He lived for 3 more years, staying active and involved with his family, still dispensing advice and telling stories to anyone who would listen. He spoke often of Delilah, keeping her memory vivid and alive, ensuring their great-grandchildren knew the story of the mountain man and the woman who was afraid of storms. In the spring of 1924, on a day when the weather was clear and beautiful, Quincy Worth died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72. His passing was mourned throughout Lusk, a town that remembered him as one of its founding fathers, a man whose quiet strength and steady devotion had been an example to multiple generations. He was buried beside Delilah in the Lusk cemetery, under a simple headstone that reads simply, "Quincy Worth, beloved husband, father, and friend." On Delilah's matching stone, their children had added a line after much discussion. She was not afraid at the end, for she was held close through every storm. In the years that followed, their story was passed down through the family, becoming the foundation on which the Worth legacy was built. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would tell it to their own children. The tale of how Quincy and Delilah had found each other during a thunderstorm in 1879 and built a love that had weathered every challenge life could throw at them. The house they had built still stood on the edge of Lusk, occupied now by their great-great-grandchildren and on stormy evenings, the family would gather there. The children would sometimes claim they could feel their great-great-grandfather's presence when thunder rolled, a solid, comforting feeling that made the fear less somehow. And the adults would smile and say that love like Quincy and Delilah shared never truly ended. It just transformed into something eternal, a legacy that passed from generation to generation. The general store that Samuel Sinclair had founded and Thomas had expanded was still operating in Lusk well into the 20th century, a thriving business that employed dozens of family members over the decades. Above the door, someone had placed a small plaque that read, "Founded 1877, Samuel Sinclair, operated continuously by the Sinclair Worth family." It was a point of pride for the town, a connection to its frontier roots. In the summer of 1979, exactly 100 years after Quincy Worth first walked into that store and helped a terrified young woman through a storm, the family gathered for a centennial celebration of Quincy and Delilah's meeting. Descendants came from all over the country, some bearing the Worth name, others carrying Sinclair, but all connected by the love story that had started their family line. The eldest living descendant, a great-great-granddaughter named Sarah who was 93 years old, stood to address the gathering. She had known Quincy briefly as a very young child and remembered him as impossibly tall and kind, with gentle hands and a voice that made you feel safe. "Our family exists because one man saw a woman in distress and decided to help," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly strong for her age. "Because he didn't judge her for her fear, and she didn't judge him for his rough edges. They chose each other, and they kept choosing each other every day for 42 years. That's what love is, and that's what they taught all of us." The celebration lasted the entire weekend, with people sharing memories passed down through generations. Photographs spread out on tables showing the progression from Quincy and Delilah's wedding day through decades of family gatherings, and stories told and retold until the listening children felt they knew their ancestors personally. On Sunday evening, as the celebration was winding down, a summer storm rolled through Lusk, and everyone laughed, saying it was fitting that the weather should mark the occasion. The youngest children were brought inside, and the family gathered in the house that Quincy had built. As thunder rolled and lightning flashed, the eldest Worth male, a 60-year-old contractor named after his great-great-grandfather, began to tell a story. His voice was deep and steady, much like Quincy's had been, and he spoke of mountains and storms, of fear and courage, of love that endured. The children listened, entranced, their fear of the storm fading as they focused on the tale. And in that moment, Quincy Worth's legacy lived on, his method for dealing with storms passed down through 5 generations, still working just as well as it had that first night in 1879, when a lonely mountain man helped a frightened woman and found his home at last. The storm passed, as storms always do. The family said their goodbyes and dispersed back to their various homes across the country. But they all carried with them the story of Quincy and Delilah, the mountain man and the woman who was afraid of thunder. It was a story about fear and courage, about finding the right person at the right time, about building something lasting through patience and devotion. In Lusk, Wyoming, where it all began, the town continued to grow and change, but some things remained constant. The cemetery on the hill where Quincy and Delilah rested side by side was always well tended, their graves marked with fresh flowers. The house Quincy built still stood strong, a testament to his skill and care. And when summer storms rolled across the plains, as they had for millennia, and would for millennia more, there were those who remembered the story and felt less afraid. because Quincy Worth had taught them all that storms could be weathered, that fear could be faced, and that love, true love of the kind he and Delilah shared, was strong enough to hold you close through anything life might bring. It was a lesson worth remembering, worth passing down, worth holding on to through every storm that ever came. And so the story ended where it began, with thunder rolling across the Wyoming plains. But now there was no fear, only memory and love, and the certain knowledge that some bonds transcend even death, enduring as long as someone remains to tell the tale of the mountain man who held his love close through every storm.